Welcome back. That was January 6th Committee Chair Benny Thompson on the importance of the committee's work in continuing to protect democracy. But as we just mentioned, all of the committee's findings and criminal referrals could be purely symbolic until the Department of Justice decides it will follow through on any indictments, leaving the impact of the report up in the air. I'm joined now by today's panel, host of NPR's Weekend Edition Sunday, Ayesha Roscoe, Navin Nayak, president of the Center for American Progress Action Fund, and Republican strategist and NBC News political analyst Rick Tyler. So, Ayesha, the final meeting, or final hearing, we should say the final meeting of the January 6th committee has taken place. We know that these criminal referrals are just referrals. They don't have legal weight. What do you, some people are just asking, is there a big point to this? Is there a big significance to this? What's your takeaway?
I mean, I think the point is for history, right? I think the point is laying out the information that Congress needed to look into this, that this was something that you couldn't just let go. I mean, this was a riot. This was an insurrection. This interfered with the peaceful transfer of power, and that you had to get a record of what happened. I also do think it has damaged Donald Trump. Yes, the number of people who feel like he was mostly responsible for January 6th has gone down. I think it's in the lower 40% now. But still, like, the popularity of Trump has diminished. And I think that January 6th and the committee has a lot to do with that.
And Navin, Ayesha just said they were talking a lot to history. There are some Democrats who definitely say that. They also say that they're hoping the DOJ will look at these referrals and might have some impact on where they go next. What's your takeaway on today's criminal referrals?
Well, even more broadly to your first question, I actually think that the committee has done the country a great service. We had a pretty horrific, terrifying, undemocratic moment, and to have not stimulated a conversation with the country. I mean, they've provided a lot of information, and they captured the country's attention. And accountability happens in a lot of ways. DOJ certainly has a role, but we saw some level of accountability at the ballot box. And I actually think the January 6th committee putting this topic front and center not only had consequences for Donald Trump, but I think there's still a reckoning in the Republican Party that has yet to come, and we saw a little bit of it in November.
And Rick, talking about a reckoning in the Republican Party, of course, it's your party. So tell us a bit about what you make of this committee's legacy. Are they talking to the DOJ, history, both, maybe Republicans?
I think we're missing the story. I mean, I get the legal analysis, but thanks for the constitutional lesson. The Congress doesn't have prosecutorial power. Okay, we got that out of the way. Everybody knows that. That's not what the Congress was doing. The Congress was laying down a marker to first establish that this was an insurrection that has serious consequence. And if we erected monuments to shameful people in the city, we would have a monument of shame that's as large as the Washington Monument with Donald Trump's name on it. That's what this committee established for all history. It will not be remembered as a partisan committee. It'll be remembered as a bipartisan committee with a bipartisan outcome that concluded that this country was in danger of an overthrow by insurrection, and we came that close to it, and it can't happen again. Politically, yes, I agree that Donald Trump has been diminished by all this because people are saying, we're done with Donald Trump. My party is starting to finally maybe move on from Donald Trump. But I think this committee did very important work. I don't think we should try to diminish it. I don't think we should get rid of the word symbolic. It's not symbolic. What this committee did was significant. It had a record. It's as powerful as the Tower Commission or the investigation of Watergate. It'll go down in history. Every historian will study it. This is what President's legacy is about, and it's one of shame.
Ayesha, what's your reaction to what Rick is talking about, especially as we know there are a number of Republicans, some who were attached to Donald Trump, but some who aren't, who are coming to Congress and are going to have control of Congress next Congress?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of Republicans right now who want to act like this isn't happening, right? Like they want to try to go ahead and say, let's talk about Hunter Biden, let's talk about all these other things. We don't want to talk about January 6th. Of course, the problem is that Donald Trump is not going to allow that to happen. He is not going to go quietly into the night, although some people may want him to. He is going to continue to talk about this, and he's going to continue to talk about the 2020 election. I mean, you and I both covered Donald Trump. We saw that he won in 2016, and he didn't let that go. Like, he was mad about that, and he won. He's not going to let go of 2020, and he's going to keep talking about it, and these issues aren't going away. Like, the issues of accepting the results of an election and not saying it was stolen from you, that has not gone away.
Well, I was going to say, I think we kind of know how Donald Trump is going to respond. We've seen it for many years. I still think the outstanding question is, how's the rest of the Republican Party going to respond? Right? The committee put down a marker. They spent a year looking at this, and they believe that the DOJ should be prosecuting Donald Trump for criminal activity. And yet the Republican Party is not saying, wait a second, the head of our party was involved in crimes, and we think that's a problem. They're all either quiet or actually criticizing the committee. And I think that's going to be a real challenge for them if they continue to be silent when you actually see the DOJ proceed with this.
And Rick, former Vice President Mike Pence, he's saying that he's hoping the DOJ doesn't bring charges against Donald Trump. How much of a reflection is what Pence is saying, the stance of the Republican Party on the whole?
Look, I don't know what Pence is thinking, whether he may be thinking political for support. I wish we just let it go, just cut it out like a cancer and get rid of it. But look, I do worry about DOJ's investigating former presidents. I do think in this case it reaches the standard. The bar should be really high. And I also agree with that. Maybe we made a mistake with Nixon. Maybe a preemptive pardon should have always been questioned, and it wasn't. And it was partly because the country wanted to heal from that. And the country did heal. It took a long time. This has been inflicted. The country will heal again. But I think in this case, the Republican Party does need to acknowledge that this was an insurrection led by someone who incited it. He is guilty of that, and he should be held accountable to that. And only then, I think, can we move beyond Donald Trump.
Well, I think the problem for Republicans is that there is a very large part of their base, or a significant enough part of their base, that is not ready to let Donald Trump go. And they don't want any apologies for January 6th. They don't want any apologies for the behavior. And so that's why you see Pence and others kind of walking this tightrope. I mean, Pence, his life was in danger.
That tightrope leads to lost elections. It led to losing the House, losing the Senate, losing the Senate again.
No, that's the question. Does it lead to lost primaries?
We'll see. We'll see if McConnell decides that he's not going to put up with outsiders picking losing candidates.
I mean, that's why we bring Ayesha on, because she asked a good question.
Ayesha, I have to jump in.
I mean, it's the question that needs to be asked. I have to ask you, Ayesha, there were other names on here, right? It's not just Donald Trump. He's obviously the big name, but there are John Eastman, and then there's the others that we're still waiting on. Yeah. What do you make of the fact that there are other people that will be criminally referred to the DOJ here?
Well, I think those people are probably less concerned. I think those people can kind of use it to burnish their, credentials. Look, the liberals came after me and they said that I did this and I stood up to them. I think there is still an appetite for that in parts of the Republican Party. I think that's just the case.
Yeah.
I think the other element here was the referrals to the Ethics Committee for four members of Congress. And the reason why I think that's going to be actually really important is we know that Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan's top priority is investigations. And the fact that they wouldn't even partake in an event like January 6th, when everyone saw with their own eyes that there was this attack on the country, and they said, no, I'm not going to partake in that, I think really calls into question their own credibility for any sort of investigations moving forward.
And Rick, I mean, while there were a lot of competitive races that election deniers lost, there are at least 156 of them that are going to be serving in Congress. And House Republicans are saying that they're going to focus a lot of their time on investigations. So what you say you want your party to do doesn't seem like they're going to do that. What's your reaction? What are your thoughts?
Look, they can elections are won by talking about the future. They're not one about talking about the past. We should have learned that lesson in 2022. We didn't learn that lesson. This should have been a layup election. All the wind was behind the Republicans' back. When 70% of the country thinks the country's going in the wrong direction, they elect the people who are in charge of the country, it tells you that the Republicans missed the mark, and they missed it by a wide mark. And we can repeat that history, or we can learn our lessons and move forward.
Well, thank you, all of you, Ayesha, Navin, Rick, for joining us.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.